here you are.
The dollar that no one saw the night had wrapped Los Angeles in a soft golden hush.
Thank you so much.
The kind that made even the busiest streets feel like they were holding their breath. Neon signs shimmered against polished windows, and the marquee outside the Riviera Theater glowed like a crown, announcing Dean Martin's name in letters taller than most men. A line of well-dressed guests stretched along the sidewalk, men in tailored suits, women in evening gowns that caught the light like falling stars, laughter floating gently above the murmur of traffic. Flashbulbs flickered. Chauffeurs opened doors. It was the kind of evening where money, fame, and celebration felt endless, where the world seemed to agree that beauty and success were the only things worth noticing, just beyond the spill of light from the theater entrance. However, where the sidewalk slipped back into shadow, an elderly woman sat on a folded piece of cardboard beside a closed flower shop. Her coat was too thin for the season. It seems worn smooth by decades of weather. Her shoes were the kind people stopped selling years ago. Wisps of silver hair escaped from beneath a knitted hat that had once been blue. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, not in the posture of begging, but in the posture of someone waiting for a bus that might never come, waiting for a face she might recognize, waiting for a world that no longer noticed her. Her name was Margaret, though almost no one had asked it in years. She had not always lived this way. There was a time when she owned a small sewing shop in Pasadena, when her fingers moved swiftly over fabric and customers lingered just to talk. There was a time when she baked bread on Sundays and kept a small radio on the windowsill, humming along to songs. She loved especially the smooth, comforting voice of a young singer named Dean Martin. His music had once filled her shop like warm light, keeping her company through long afternoons. But time, illness, and a series of quiet losses had slowly taken that life away. The shop closed. Friends moved on. Family drifted into memories. In one winter, after a landlord sold the building, Margaret found herself carrying what remained of her world in 2 plastic bags. That night, she had not come to the theater hoping to see a celebrity. She had come because the warmth from the lights spilled onto the sidewalk. And warmth was something she measured carefully now. She watched people pass, some laughing, some arguing softly, some staring into the distance as if already bored of joy. Most did not see her. A few saw her and looked away faster. Every so often, someone dropped a coin into the paper cup near her feet without slowing down. The sound of metal against cardboard, sharp and lonely. Margaret waited longer than she meant to. The hunger in her stomach had become a familiar ache, dull but persistent, like an old wound that never quite healed. Finally, when a small break opened in the crowd, she gathered the courage she rationed more carefully than food. She stood, steadying herself against the brick wall, and took 2 small steps forward into the edge of the light. "Excuse me," she said softly. Her voice was thin. Not from weakness, but from years of being unused. A man brushed past her without hearing. Another smiled politely, but kept walking. Then a ripple of movement traveled through the guests near the entrance. Conversations shifted. A few heads turned at once. The flashbulbs intensified. Dean Martin had arrived. He stepped from a dark car with the unhurried ease of someone who had learned long ago not to chase attention. It would come on its own. His suit was midnight blue, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression relaxed, carrying the faint, familiar warmth people recognized from screens and stages. He thanked the driver, nodded to the doorman, and greeted a couple of familiar faces. To most of the crowd, he was the night's centerpiece. To Margaret, he was suddenly something else entirely. For a moment, she did not move. She simply watched him, surprised by how ordinary he seemed in motion, how human. Not a voice from a radio, not a name on a poster. Just a man walking toward a door before she could talk herself out of it. She lifted her chin and spoke again, louder this time, not to him specifically, but to the air between them. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you." Dean Martin slowed. Not because someone had called his name, but because something in the tone of her voice carried weight. He turned slightly, scanning the sidewalk, and his gaze landed on her. The world around them did not stop. People still talked. Cameras still clicked. but something in the space between them shifted, as if a smaller, quieter scene had begun inside the larger one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Margaret swallowed. She had rehearsed this in her head many times, always ending with silence. Now the words felt heavier than she expected. "I don't usually ask," she said, which was true. "But could you spare $1? Just $1. I'd like to get something warm to eat." It was not the request people expected outside a glittering theater. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was not desperate. It was precise. $1. Not charity. Not rescue. Just enough to change the next hour. A few people nearby slowed their steps. Some watched with curiosity, others with mild discomfort. A publicist half a step behind Dean shifted uneasily, ready to intervene, to redirect, to protect the schedule. This was not part of the evening's design. Dean did not answer right away. He looked at Margaret, not at her clothes, not at the cup, but at her face. The deep lines there did not speak of bitterness. They spoke of years, of endurance, of someone who had not expected much from the world for a long time and had learned to carry herself. Gently, anyway. He took a step closer, then another. Close enough now that the noise of the crowd softened, as if the air itself had chosen to listen. Margaret braced herself for the familiar endings. A quick apology, a distracted smile, a hand-waving regret. She had seen them all. They were efficient. They hurt less than cruelty because they pretended kindness without giving it. Instead, Dean Martin did something that made the people around them grow. Strangely quiet, he reached into his jacket, not for his wallet. "Not yet," he extended. His hand first. "My name is Dean," he said simply. Margaret hesitated, then placed her small, cool hand into his. His grip was warm, steady. "I'm Margaret," she replied, and in that moment, before any money changed hands, before any photographs were taken, before anyone realized something extraordinary was unfolding, Dean Martin looked at her and said something no one expected. "Margaret, tell me how you ended up here." The question was not hurried. It was not polite decoration. It was not asked over her head or past her. It was offered to her fully, around them. The bright entrance to the Riviera Theater glowed, the symbol of 1,000 untold stories of fame and fortune. But just outside its doors, another story had quietly begun, one that had nothing to do with applause, and everything to do with seeing. And Margaret, who had come only to ask for $1, suddenly found herself being asked for something far rarer, her story. For a moment after Dean Martin asked the question, Margaret did not answer. Not because she didn't have a story, but because she had too many. Layered on top of one another like old photographs in a box no one opened anymore. The noise of the streets seemed to pull away from her, retreating into a distant hum, till all she could truly hear was her own breathing and the steady patience in the man's eyes before her. It startled her more than any raised voice ever could. People who gave money rarely asked questions. People who asked questions rarely waited for real answers. "I don't want to take your time," she said at last, her instinct to disappear rising automatically. "You have somewhere to be." Dean glanced briefly toward the theater entrance, where the doors still stood open and bright, where people expected him, where his name shimmered above the crowd. Then he looked back at her. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he replied. Something fragile loosened in Margaret's chest. She exhaled, slowly, as if letting out air she had been holding for years, and she shifted her weight against the brick wall. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different texture, not thin now, but worn like cloth that had been folded and unfolded too many times. "I used to have a shop," she began. "A little sewing place. Not fancy, but it was mine." Her eyes drifted somewhere past the lights, past the theater, to a place that lived only inside her now. It had been called Margaret's Alterations, a narrow storefront near a bus stop in Pasadena, where the bell on the door rang like a small celebration every time someone entered. She tailored wedding dresses and school uniforms and coats that had been loved too long. She fixed hymns while listening to the radio. Dean Martin's voice had been a regular guest there, filling the air with warmth, keeping her company when business was slow. Customers would tease her about singing along. She would pretend she didn't, though she always did. There were years, she said, when I thought that shop would outlive me. Faint smile touched her mouth, then faded. Her husband, Thomas, had helped her build it. He'd painted the sign himself, steadying the ladder with one hand and laughing when she worried he'd fall. They never had much, but they had rhythm. He passed away quietly one autumn, sitting in his chair by the window, a book still open on his lap. After that, Margaret kept the shop open longer hours, not for money, but because closing it meant returning to an apartment that had learned how to echo. Then came the sickness. Not dramatic, not sudden. The kind that arrives like fog, unnoticed until everything feels heavier. Hospital visits ate her savings. Equipment replaced curtains. The shop became harder to manage. 1 year business slowed. Another year the building was sold. The new owner raised the rent beyond what her small hands and faithful radio could hold. And one day, she said quietly, I locked the door for the last time and put the key in an envelope. I don't even remember where I put it. Now, Dean listened without interruption. He did not nod in the way people do to hurry pain along. He did not check his watch. He stood with his hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. The crowd around them slowly reorganizing itself into a loose, respectful distance, as if something unspoken had passed between them that others could sense. I thought I'd find something else, Margaret continued. A room, a job, a corner that still had my name on it. But time moves faster when you're tired, and suddenly you're carrying your life instead of living it. She gestured faintly to the bags at her feet. There was a long pause. Dean broke it gently. And tonight? He asked. Margaret's lips pressed together. Tonight I came because the lights are warm here, and because people are kinder when they're dressed like they're celebrating something. That answer landed between them with quiet force. Dean looked at her cup and back at her. You asked me for $1, he said. Why $1? Margaret hesitated, then gave a small, almost embarrassed shrug. Because $1 doesn't scare people. It doesn't make them feel responsible. It just lets them feel finished. The words were not spoken with accusation. They were spoken with understanding around them. A man in a dark suit raised his phone, uncertain. A woman nearby lowered hers. The publicist had stopped moving. Even the doorman's attention drifted. Dean reached into his jacket again. This time, he removed his wallet, but instead of opening it, he held it in his hand, studying Margaret as if measuring something invisible. Margaret, he said, when was the last time someone sat with you? She blinked. I don't. I'm not sure. Not gave you something, he clarified. Sat with you. The answer frightened her by how long it took to find. I don't remember, she said honestly. Dean exhaled. Then, in a gesture no one expected, he closed his wallet again and slipped it back into his pocket. The crowd shifted, confused. This was the moment people knew, the giving moment. The small performance of kindness they understood. Instead, Dean Martin stepped closer to the wall, bent slightly, and lowered himself onto the edge of the cold sidewalk beside her. Gasps rippled. Someone whispered his name. A camera flashed. He didn't look up. He sat. At her level, the world tilted, for the first time in years. Margaret was not being addressed from above, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Someone had chosen the ground where she was. She stared at him, startled, unsure whether to speak or to protect him from her own confusion. You don't have to do that, she said quickly. I know, he replied. That's why I am. They sat in silence for a few moments, the kind that is not empty, but listening. Margaret, he said at last, you didn't lose your life. You lost your place. There's a difference. Her eyes filled despite her effort. No one's ever said that to me, she whispered. He nodded, as if confirming something he had already decided. You asked me for $1, he went on, but I don't think that's what you need. He reached into his pocket again. This time, he took out a single, folded bill. He placed it gently into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "There's your dollar," he said softly. Then he covered her hand with his own. "But before we talk about anything else," he added, "I want you to tell me what you loved most about your shop." Margaret looked down at her closed hand, then back at him, her breath unsteady. "What I loved most," she repeated. "Yes." She searched herself. "The bell," she said finally. "The little one on the door? Every time it rang, it meant someone needed me." Dean smiled faintly. "That," he said, "is not something a person misplaces." And with that simple sentence, something unseen began to move, not in the crowd, not in the cameras, but in the quiet architecture of a woman who had believed her usefulness had ended. What Margaret could not yet know was that this was not a conversation. It was a crossing, and Dean Martin had not sat down to give her a dollar. He had sat down too. Changed the direction of a life. The sidewalk outside the Riviera Theater no longer felt like a sidewalk. It felt like a pause in the world. Dean Martin still sat beside Margaret, the glow from the marquee spilling over both of them, catching in the silver of her hair and the polished leather of his shoes. People had stopped pretending not to watch. Some stood frozen mid-step. Others hovered at a respectful distance, unsure whether they were witnessing a private moment or the beginning of something larger. The cameras that had arrived for glamour now hovered uncertainly, sensing that whatever was unfolding could not be captured by a smile. Margaret held the folded dollar in her hand, as if it were not money, but a small, fragile proof of something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She had just finished describing her shop in more detail, the way the window fogged in winter, the sound of scissors against fabric, the small wooden box where she kept buttons customers always forgot to collect. Her voice had grown steadier as she spoke, warmed by memory. "That bell," she said again softly, "made me feel expected." Dean nodded slowly. "You still are," he said. She looked at him then with a trace of confusion. "By who?" "By the world," he replied. It just forgot how to say it. There was a brief stir behind them as a man in a dark coat leaned forward. "Dean," he murmured. Gently, but urgently, "they're waiting inside." Dean did not turn. "They can wait," he answered. The man hesitated, then stepped back. Margaret lowered her gaze. "You're missing your night because of me." Dean finally looked toward the theater doors. Music drifted faintly from inside, applause from some earlier moment brushing the air like distant thunder. He looked back to her. "No," he said. "I'm using it." He shifted slightly, then surprised her by asking a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Margaret, can you still sew?" Her brow creased. "I haven't had a machine in years. That's not what I asked."
"Ow."
She considered. Slowly, she lifted her hands, turning them over as if seeing them again for the first time. The fingers were thin. The skin was loose, but they were steady. "I think," she said carefully, "I could still remember how." Dean's gaze rested on her hands, thoughtful. "Would you want to?" He asked. The question unsettled her. "Want to what? To be needed that way again?" A silence followed, heavier than any before, because this question did not offer food. It offered a future. Margaret's throat tightened. "I don't know if the world wants old hands anymore." Dean's voice was gentle, but firm. "The world always wants hands that care." He rose then, slowly, dusting his palms together, and extended his hand to her. "Come with me," he said. Her first instinct was fear. "Where?" "Across the street." She looked past him at the wide boulevard, the traffic flowing like a river of light. She had crossed many streets in her life, but this one felt different, as if it separated not just two sidewalks, but two directions. "I don't belong in there," she said quietly. Glancing at the theater, "I didn't say inside," he replied. "I said across." After a moment's hesitation, she took his hand. He helped her stand. The crowd stirred again, a murmur rising as people instinctively parted to make room. Together, they moved to the crosswalk. Cars slowed. A few drivers recognized him and waved, puzzled. Dean raised a hand in polite acknowledgement. but did not release Margaret's. They crossed. On the far side of the street stood a narrow, dim storefront wedged between a closed bookstore and a cafe whose lights had already been lowered for the night. Its windows were dark, its sign old and peeling. Dean stopped before it. Margaret followed his gaze. "It's been empty for years," she said. "I've slept near here sometimes." Dean studied the front door. "Do you know what it used to be?" She squinted. "I think a tailor. A long time ago," he smiled faintly. "There you are then." He reached into his pocket and removed a small notebook. He tore out a page and wrote something quickly, shielding it from the onlookers who had drifted closer, curiosity now fully awake. He folded the paper and handed it to her. "What's this?" She asked. "A name," he said, "and an address." She unfolded it. It was his. "I don't understand," she whispered. Dean met her eyes. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "someone will be opening that door for the first time in a long while. Not for me. For you." Margaret's breath caught. "I don't have anything," she said. "No machine. No money. No." "You have hands," he said. "In stories, in a bell you miss." She looked back at the dark storefront, a place she had never once imagined could belong to her. "I can't accept something like this," she said. "I only asked for $1. Dean's expression softened. "And if I had only given you $1, he replied, "I would have been finished. I'm not." Behind them, a woman's voice rose quietly, emotional. "Is this real?" Dean turned slightly, acknowledging the crowd for the first time. "Not everything that matters is supposed to be entertainment," he said. Then he faced Margaret again. "This isn't charity," he continued. "It's partnership. So, I'll make sure the door opens. What walks through it? We'll let the world decide." Margaret's hands trembled. "What if no one comes?" Then he said, "We'll know who to invite." A police officer at the corner, who had been watching carefully, stepped closer. "Everything all right here, sir?" Dean nodded. "Better than all right?" The officer looked at Margaret, then back at Dean. Something shifting behind his professional calm. "If you need anything," he said. It meant more than procedure. When he stepped away, Dean placed his hand lightly over Margaret's shoulder. "There's one more thing," he said. She looked up. "You asked me for $1, he continued, "and I gave it to you. But I haven't answered you yet." "Answered me?" She echoed. "Yes," he said. "Your question." She searched his face. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Margaret," he said, "you didn't ask for money. You asked whether you were still allowed to exist in the middle of the world." Her breath broke. "And the answer," he continued, "is yes." Loudly, her eyes filled. The street around them blurred. What neither of them fully realized yet was that people were no longer watching a celebrity be kind. They were watching a boundary dissolve, and somewhere between the dark storefront and the bright theater, a future had quietly chosen its shape. The crowd outside the Riviera Theater had not dispersed. If anything, it had quietly reorganized itself into something else. No one was shouting. No one was pushing forward. There was simply a widening circle of people who had forgotten their original plans. Some still held tickets. Some still held cameras. Some still held the last words Dean Martin had spoken to Margaret, as if they were something fragile, something not meant to be handled carelessly. The dark storefront across the street now stood at the center of that circle like an unopened door in a dream. Margaret remained where Dean had left her, one hand pressed lightly to her chest, the folded paper with his name still open in the other. Her mind could not yet decide whether what had happened belonged to the future or the imagination. The streetlight above her flickered softly, and for a moment, it reminded her of the small lamp she once kept beside her sewing machine. The one that burned warm and constant through late evenings of mending. Dean stood a few steps away, speaking quietly with the theater manager. There were no grand gestures, no public declarations, only a calm exchange, the kind that built things rather than announced them. When he returned, Margaret noticed something new in his hands, a small flat case. He knelt in front of her, setting it gently on the pavement between them. "I had this in the car," he said. "I bring it when I travel. He opened it. Inside lay a pair of silver tailoring shears, their handles worn smooth. The metal darkened by years of careful use. Margaret inhaled sharply. "I thought I lost them," she whispered. Dean looked up surprised. "You recognize them?" She nodded, unable to look away. "My husband had a pair just like these. Same weight, same curve. He used to say, you could tell a lot about a person by the tools they kept." Dean lifted them and placed them carefully into her hands. "I don't know if they're like his," he said, "but they fixed more than a few costumes, more than a few torn seams. They've earned another life." Margaret closed her fingers around them, and something inside her finally gave way. She did not cry loudly. She did not cover her face. She simply bowed her head, and the tears came as if they had been waiting years for permission. The crowd felt it, not as spectacle as recognition. Dean did not rush her. He waited. When she finally looked up again, her voice shook. "Why are you doing this?" She asked. "You don't even know me." Dean smiled gently. "I know exactly one thing about you," he said, "and it's enough." "What's that?" "You didn't ask me for everything," he replied. "You asked me for $1." She frowned slightly. "You could have asked for more," he continued. "Most people would have." "You didn't. That told me you weren't trying to be saved. You were trying to stay standing." He let that settle before continuing. "And people who are still trying to stand," he said quietly, "don't need rescue. They need a door." He rose and extended his hand again. "Come." They crossed the street once more, the movement now deliberate, almost ceremonial. The theater lights still burned behind them, but fewer people were watching those now. Most eyes followed the elderly woman in the thin coat, holding a pair of silver shears like a fragile promise. Dean stopped in front of the dark storefront and removed a small ring of keys from his pocket. He selected one. Then he paused. The street was silent enough that the click of metal could have been thunder. He turned to Margaret before opening the door. "This is where you asked me for $1, he said. She nodded. "This is where I'm answering you." He placed the key in the lock, but he did not turn it. Instead, he faced her fully, his voice calm, steady, carrying beyond the two of them now, reaching the people who had unconsciously leaned closer. "Margaret," he said, "you didn't ask me for money. You asked me if you still mattered." The words landed differently when spoken aloud, and here is my reply. He gently placed the key in her hand. "You matter enough," he continued, "that tomorrow this door will open because of you. And the day after that, and the day after that, you matter enough that your hands deserve a place to work. Your stories deserve a place to live. Your name deserves to be on a window again." Margaret's breath trembled. "You matter," he finished, "because you are still here." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Margaret turned the key. The lock released with a soft, almost shy sound. Dean opened the door. Darkness met them, dust and quiet, and the faint memory of what the space had once been. He stepped aside. "After you," he said. Margaret crossed the threshold. The crowd did not cheer. They exhaled inside. The air smelled of old wood and time. Dean reached in and flicked a small switch near the door. A single light blinked on. It was not bright, but it was enough. Margaret stood in the doorway, the silver shears in her hands catching the glow. She closed her eyes, and in the silence, she heard it not real, but remembered. The bell, the sound that meant someone needed her. Dean watched her face change. "This place doesn't need much," he said. "A table, a machine, a sign, the rest. You already have." She turned to him. "Overwhelmed. I don't know how to thank you." Dean shook his head gently. "You already did," he said. "When you trusted me with your story." A young woman in the crowd finally spoke, her voice unsteady. "Sir, can I help?" Then another. "I know a place that donates machines." Another. "My mother has fabric she's been saving for years." The street stirred, not with noise, with motion. Dean glanced back at Margaret. a quiet understanding passing between them. "This," he said, "is how doors stay open." Margaret stepped back onto the sidewalk, no longer apart from it, no longer hidden within it. She looked at the folded dollar still tucked in her coat, then up at him. "I almost didn't ask," she said. He smiled softly. "I'm glad you did." She hesitated. "Dean." "Yes. Do you think," she asked, "someone will ring the bell tomorrow?" Dean looked at the growing group of people already talking, already planning, already rearranging their night around a woman they had not known an hour ago. He answered without hesitation. "They already have. And for the first time in years." Margaret laughed, not loudly, but fully.